Hi and welcome to the next playthrough from the Blue Tweezers here. This time we'll be looking at Fields of Fire 2, the 5th Marines in World War II, Korea, Vietnam. Its subtitle is also With the Old Breed, although you only see that in certain places in the game. Squad level solitaire game. It's number 2 in the series. Fields of Fire there on the right is the original one, which I've had for many a long year. 2008 was the publishing date on that, so it's taken a while to get the second one in. And yeah, it's a solitaire game, squad level, but focuses on command. Even more than we saw with the Gallipoli 1915 game. Command is almost most of the game here. The combat is it's not quite an afterthought, but it's a consequence of command. So, what's the game about? Well, you actually control a company of, in the case of Fields of Fire, the original, a company of the 9th US Infantry. In Fields of Fire 2, it's actually a company of the 5th Marines, 5th Marine Regiment. So the designer, Ben Hull, it's published by GMT, but the designer Ben Hull, I understand, is actually a military person himself. Yeah, the concept of the game is almost a simulation of small unit command, rather than a pure game. It's very simulation like, and the simulation is really about command and control. You are involved with HQs, passing orders to each other, taking initiative, communications between those. Of various types. And as with solitaire games, you have a mission, there is a series of missions, and you generally, with offensive missions, you're advancing up the board, such as it is, and to get to objectives. Or if you're on a defensive mission, you're actually trying to hold on to the terrain you're at. And there are patrol missions where you have sort of chance encounters as well. The 3 theatres, World War II, Korea and Vietnam, same for each of the games, but of course they're not in exactly the same place, particularly with the World War II. So in World War II, with Fields of Fire, you were fighting in Normandy, and with Fields of Fire 1, and with Fields of Fire 2, you're actually on an invasion of Pacific Island, Peleliu. Yeah, that's the others, Korea and Vietnam. They also differ as well. Korea and Vietnam. Korea, the 9th Infantry, Fields of Fire 1, you were at the what's known as the Pusan Perimeter. It's known as the Nak Tong campaign, where you're defending against the North Koreans attacking into South Korea. With the Fields of Fire 2, with Korea, you're actually fighting the Chinese infantry at Chosin Reservoir. Finally, the Vietnam. So the Vietnam in Fields of Fire was generally about search and destroy missions, about landing with helicopters and things like that. The Vietnam in Fields of Fire 2 is quite different. It's about the campaign to retake Hue City after the Tet Offensive. So the Vietnam game on Fields of Fire 2 is very similar to the others, that you're again trying to take ground. With the original Fields of Fire, you were landing troops via helicopters into almost the centre of the board and spreading out from there, and you had landing zones to deal with and things like that. It looks like the Vietnam in Fields of Fire 2 is much more linear than the Fields of Fire 1 Vietnam. So a little bit about what the game is like. to play. One thing I would say is this is not for the faint-hearted. I know I kind of said that with Gallipoli 1915, and to be honest, they're probably a similar level of difficulty. The game's quite fiddly. You are constantly checking backwards and forwards on things, and there's a lot of counters sort of spread out and tracks to keep track of things. So it is a tricky game to play, but it is very rewarding. I have found that with Fields of Fire 1, certainly. The rules, however, are, well, it's difficult to say, but you could class it as a problem. They're quite dense. They're kind of written with it's a little bias in that you should kind of know what the rules are talking about, and you should be able to figure out situations that come up in the game from what's written in the rules, but without sometimes the rules specifically saying what you should do. You kind of have to piece it together. There's a certain jigsaw about it, and as it's a dense rule book and there's quite a lot of pages, that can take some time. It can be a little frustrating, and you can sort of sit there and go, well, what was I meant to do in this particular situation? There's been a lot of talk about the rules online. The Fields of Fire 2 used what's known as the second edition of the rules. Fields of Fire 1 had the first edition, of course, and then the second edition was published a few years back. But the Fields of Fire 2 is pretty much the same, with, I think, some extra rules on things like urban warfare, which didn't exist before, that are used in the Vietnam era scenarios. And there's a certain amount of disorganisation in the rules. It's logically constructed, but your need for the rules information cuts across that, sometimes quite obliquely, where in a particular situation you've got to just check rules from several different areas. Even though they're kind of related to the situation, they're in different blocks of the rules. So, for example, if there is a doubt about what happens with a particular firing, the firing happening to some units, you may need to check the fire combat area, you may need to check the spotting area, you may need to check the enemy activity area, you may need to check LOS area, and even though the rules are all there, this kind of need to look across the rules can be quite frustrating at times. And so I've seen online, and there's been a lot of talk, not just with Fields of Fire 2, but Fields of Fire 1, that it's just too much, and it kind of stops you enjoying the game. I don't find that. As you probably saw with Gallipoli 1915, I'm quite willing to slog through some heavy rule books, and what you actually get out of this game is something that's really very different. It's not really like any other solitaire game. It's not really like any other war game I've ever tried before. It really does come from a very unique angle, and that's refreshing in its own right. And when you get things to work, it can run smoothly until you come up against the opposition, of course. But you can get a rhythm going. It can be really frustrating to play because you know what you need to do and you haven't got the ability to do it due to where your troops are, how they're communicating, how many orders are available, what weapon systems you have available, and just the bloody mindedness of the opposition. And the AI in this is actually quite good. It's not sophisticated, particularly, but it does really have a good effect, and it can stymie you. And turn after turn after turn, you just hit a brick wall. Even though you may have overwhelming force, there's no way you can actually deal with what's in front of you. You have to call up extra troops or try and outflank, or sometimes just call in the artillery and just hope that you blow everything up in the opposition area. You are time limited as well, so each of the missions that you do in a campaign, so each of the 3 eras, there's a campaign in each, you have a number of turns in each mission. If you don't succeed, you can have a second go where you basically start off again where you left off to try and complete the mission. But even that, there's only so many times you can retry. It depends on the mission. Sometimes you can't even retry. So you are under that time pressure as well. So all in all, it's quite a unique experience. You kind of think that you're there, not to be too lyrical about it, but you're down with the grunts in the mud kind of thing, and suffering what they're suffering because of your frustrations and not being able to do things. And if you make a mistake and you lose, you gain casualties, or you lose a position or something, or you are stuck and you run out of time, you get quite emotionally invested in it. So it's a shame that the rules can sometimes put people off the experience, but actually it is really rewarding. And so you'll get these 2 camps online I've seen where there's some people who have kind of done the hard yards. They've kind of gone through the whole process of slogging through the rulebook and really getting to know how the rules work, and then the system really sings at you. You have those people, and there's other people who go, well, I paid so many bucks, $60, $70 for the game, and I expect it to be able to be playable, and I can't be asked working out exactly what the rules meant for me to do in certain situations. And it's a pity that camp exists, but I understand why. And sometimes I'm a little frustration, and I have to go out online and see, usually somebody's asked the same question, going, well, if I'm in this situation, how does the rules kind of says this and this, but it doesn't quite cover what's happening here. What should I do? But anyway, that's as it is. So I'll just go through some of the components and the sequence of play and the counters, etc., and how it plays. I'm not going to go too deep into it, otherwise this intro will be extremely long, probably quite boring, and you'd probably glaze over very, very quickly, because there is a lot here. But the basic framework and how the sequence of play works kind of leads you into how to play the game. That's quite often how solitaire games are, is that the sequence of play and is actually funneling you into doing certain things at certain times, so that you get that solitaire experience and you get that automatic responses from the game, as in the enemy, etc., happen at certain times. So the sequence is very important. So the first thing to talk about is the board, as in there isn't one. There is no board in the game. What there is a series of terrain cards, which come from terrain decks. As you see in front of you, there's 3 terrain decks. There's the Peleliu 1944, Chasing Reservoir, which is the Korea, and Battle Hue, which is the Vietnam. And you use these cards to create the deck. You might have seen earlier in the video, I had a grid of cards. If we look at these cards in particular, I haven't actually opened these 2 guys yet. I'm still working on the World War II. So what we have, if I show you here, in fact I'll put it down and zoom in, that's a terrain card. And of course you've got the title. This is a Coral Peak. If I get maybe a couple of others here, there's a Blasted Jungle to see as well. Let's get them side by side. And there are several things on the card. The first thing that's really important, and I'm trying to see one that actually makes a difference here. Here we go. This is an airfield terrain card. So first thing is actually the border. So the border here, all white, border here, all green. It's either white or green. Can be a mix. And in each direction, if there's a white border, line of sight can be traced through the terrain card. If it's green, it can only be traced into, but not through. So you can see this blasted jungle is completely LOS blocking, whereas the airfield is completely isn't as well. So so there is LOS in this game, and there is range. So there are 4 ranges, I believe. So point blank is on the same card, close is adjacent card, long range is 2 cards away, and very long range is 3 cards away, and that's as far as it goes. Although things like artillery fire can be further away, of course, because they can come from on board. Right, so next significant thing is the terrain value. So this is the basic terrain value that the card offers in fire combat, in defence. Positive number is better, so 0 is just as bad as it gets. An airfield with not a lot of cover, it's not surprising. Okay, what you sometimes get is a vehicle. There's not one here, there's a vehicle one here, which is either there isn't one, there is a slow, or there is a no. No means you can't drive a vehicle into that terrain. Slow means you can drive into it, but you have to stop on that and can only move on in your next turn. There's another symbol here, which again doesn't affect the airfield, which is a modifier for incoming fire, so incoming strikes. That is artillery strikes, air strikes, mortar, that kind of thing. So that's a modifier there, so it actually makes it slightly worse in defending against artillery fire. Then down the bottom, this is all about the cover on the card. So just starting on the right here, this 0, this is the height of the terrain. So usually it'll be a 0 and a 1. The 1 would usually be a hill, or would be, say, a multi-storey building, something like that. These next 2 are related together. So this is the number of cover markers that are available. So in addition to the defence, you have some cover which you can search out and sit in, and it will give you some extra defence, an extra +1 pretty much. Now that's the number of cover markers that could be found and used, and this is the number of cards which are drawn in the action deck to find out whether you have found that terrain cover or not. It's usually not a good idea for everybody to huddle into the same cover, especially when artillery is around, because you could actually suffer from a great amount of casualties. If you're on different cover, though, on the same card, you may have communication problems because you're not actually being able to see each other. You're both hidden from each other as well as the enemy, or at least obstructed. So as you can see here, there's more cover available and it's easier to get to it. 4 cards and there's 3 available. Here on the airfield, there's only 1 available, and you pull 2 cards to find the cover symbol. That's all I really want to say about terrain. I'll just show you the setup for the current mission we're going to be playing and looking at the grid. Right, so that's the grid we're going to be playing here. It's 4x4, so normally in the game you start from the bottom and your objectives are towards the top. It can be expanded normally, won't be in this scenario, but can be expanded normally due to enemies appearing, so that they can appear off board and you actually extend the board for them. Normally you don't do it for your own troops. They're kind of fixed in their area of operations. It's presumed that there is another company to the left, another company to the right, and this is your area where you have to do your mission. As we can see on this one, if I zoom in slightly, we can see that actually as we look, just bring it a little bit across. In this instance, with each row, they're actually the same terrain card. This is to represent the landings at Peleliu. So the bottom card is the surf zone. So actually it's the water. And they're all the same. And this actually continues on. So the second set of cards are the beach cards. And again, all the same. There is a variation in the actual picture in the middle that doesn't have any effect on play. Each of the beach cards are exactly the same. Going one further up, we have the dunes card. So sand dunes here, just beyond the beach. And again, they're all the same. Finally, at the top, if I just zoom in to see, we have the palm groves. And again, all 4 in a row. Now, it's interesting that this is where Fields of Fire 2 slightly differs from Fields of Fire 1. In Fields of Fire 1, most of the scenarios had random draws of terrain. And if you were advancing, they were turned face down. And only when you had line of sight to that card would it be turned up. And you knew what was there. Going through the whole of Fields of Fire 2, pretty much all of the scenarios are programmed terrain setups, so that it gives you effectively a map of the map to say, well, these cards work in these ways. And that's not only just for what's in the terrain, but also their height as well. So it's a lot less random than Fields of Fire 1. That's it's a differential which is interesting. You know what you're going to face. Doesn't necessarily make it that much easier though, although you think it would. Particularly with Peleliu, the first 3 missions, I believe, are actually linked. And if you can imagine, there is bands of or rows of cards beyond the palm groves, which are actually the airfield, which in subsequent missions you kind of shuffle up the terrain, and it is actually about sort of 7 cards deep, as opposed to the 4 you need here. But for this mission you only need the first 4, and you'd reset for the second and third anyway. So next I want to look at the sequence of play, and this is the sequence of play on the back of the rulebook. Seems quite heavy, although certainly there's some sections that you won't use in a mission, because there are, either depending on what type of mission it is, some bits come in or not. But essentially it's in 3 sections. There is a command phase in which actually you do all your movement as well, and you sort out what your troops are doing, and they actually do it. They do their activities. Then you have an enemy activity segment in which you find out what the enemies that are already on the board are doing. And then finally you have a combat phase, which is find out what enemies are going to appear, and then effectively each of the 2 sides have at each other with the firing capability that has been established during the activity phase. There is another couple of little phases, but I'll just leave it at that for the moment. But we'll go through in detail. So the first thing you do in a turn is what's known as the higher HQ event phase up here. And you don't do it on the first turn. So your highest, normal highest command level in the game is the company commander, the CO, company CO. Now, of course, he's not the be all and end all. He's getting his orders from further up, and this phase is all about establishing what the, if anything, other orders are coming down to from battalion HQ. So this looks at the battalion HQ phase. Then if you're on a defensive mission, then you do the enemy activity first before your own. But normally, if you're on the offensive, you go first, which is the third phase. Now, this is a very long phase here, as you can see, but it's quite repetitive. Effectively, the same thing happens over and over and over again to different levels of command. So the first thing that happens is that you activate usually your company HQ. Now this is where I want to bring in the action deck. So this is the randomizer in the game. So the deck is here. I've put them in card sleeves. Believe me, I really advise you putting them into card sleeves because you will be shuffling this deck over and over and over again. You won't necessarily go through the whole of it every single time, and you will be turning several cards over one after the other in the play. So my old set on Fields of Fire 1, I probably haven't played it enough for it to have too much of an effect, but very quickly I thought I needed some card sleeves, so I've done that with the Fields of Fire 2 deck immediately. So if we look on the card here, there's several randomizers all on the same card. Let me zoom in so you can see in detail. So there's a command section which is up in the top left hand corner, and that's what we're concerned with during the command phase here. Down on the left hand side here, this is the combat area to see whether you have hit or not, or pinned an enemy, or they have done the same thing to you. There's a hit effect, which is once there's a hit, you look on the hit effect area to see what damage has been done. And then finally at the bottom there is a randomizer which is variable to the number you need to randomize to. So the top line is the number of possibilities that you were told to check, and then the number at the bottom is the actual outcome. So for example here we have 7. If you were supposed to look on a number 7 for 7 different possibilities in the randomization, you would look down and it's actually a 5. So it's if you rolled a d7 and you got a 5. Note there isn't a 1 here. It always starts at 2 because of course a randomizer of 1 is always 1, so you don't really need that. But that's how you do that randomizer. And then this big panel here is basically for everything else and consists of a number of icons. They can, and those number of icons can be represented. I have a selection here. These are the icons that could be possibly on that section of card, possibly some more as well, but I think this covers most of them. This also covers terrain as well here, but this gives you an idea of the things that are available. And what you're generally looking to do is when you're trying to do that kind of activity or get a kind of result that you want, you're turning over cards, a number of cards depending on how good your troops are or what the circumstances are. And within that number of card pools, you want to look for a particular word or icon, etc. So one that's particularly pertinent here is that's an HQ symbol. So with the battalion HQ roll, or card pull roll, you get used to talking about dice here, but there are no dice in the game. That would mean that there is an HQ activity, and you look up in the chart. Again, randomize using the bottom, not the same card. You only use a card for one use. And then you look up on the next card what the result is. It's usually checking on the 10 column. The 10 tends to be most of the lookups that you happen. The other ones generally where you have, say, several different, say you're looking at 4 different combats, which one do you do first? It's not up to you which one you do first. You randomize it. So if there were 4 combats, you would do combat number 3 first. You'd name it before drawing the card. So these are only one use for any particular lookup. As in, if you get a hit on the combat chart, you pull a different one to get the hit effect. So this is an HQ. It also has an AT value that's normally present. Can be from 0 up to I think 8. And the anti-tank is a little different. The vehicles are kind of moved slightly out of the rest of the sequence of play, and I'll come on to that. And in this one here, if you were looking to throw a grenade, and yes, you get an activity to throw a grenade, in this game. If you get this symbol, then you've successfully thrown a grenade into the enemy position, and yeah, it's a very good combat modifier for throwing grenades. Also here, if you were looking for cover, which I showed you earlier, if you're looking for cover, you were looking for that name. There are others such as rally, contact, etc., which you are looking for. So that's the action deck in itself, and you plough through the cards, and at some point you will get to a reshuffle card. Could be anywhere in the deck, and you then reshuffle and start pulling again. Now, coming back to the friendly command phase, you would normally find out what the company HQ orders are, and that's using that big number in the top left corner, so 3. That would be the base number of orders that the CO gets. And what you then do is say, right, in this phase, what are you going to spend them on? So you spend HQs on ordering things to happen. Generally what the CO does is he orders other HQs. So there are platoon HQs, there are section HQs, or even the individual units, but usually HQs that you activate so that they can then do a card draw to see how many orders they get. And that's how you follow down this sequence. So the activation segment, Battalion HQ can exist in the game, so you do have that phase, but usually you just use the CO HQ as the part of that. Then the CO impulse, you spend the commands, you can save them. Then you go on to the platoon HQ impulse here, or the CO staff. So there are extra commanders in a company. There's sergeants, first sergeants, and executive officers as well, which can actually do things as well as the platoon HQs. Underneath the platoons, you then have the squads. So in each of these are ordering units below them in the hierarchy to do things, or HQs if there are subsequent HQs. Once you get to the end point where the CO has run out of commands, or as many as you want to play, you can save them. You then get to the initiative segment, which you run through again, and anything that hasn't been activated in the activation segment can then have a chance to have an initiative impulse, which is self-generated commands rather than going through the hierarchy. So if we can again look back at this card, you'll see there's a little 1. Now that is the activation number. This is the initiative number. So an HQ that pulled a 3 here, if it was activated, it would use a 3. If it was using its impulse though, it would only get 1. This number can be modified, usually by the quality of the troops, or the unit that it is actually being commanded. You can do this down to the platoons and then the company staff as well, which is just off the thing here. And finally you have this interesting thing which is known as general initiative. And what you do is you pull another card, look at the little number, and then that number of orders are available to any unit on the board that hasn't been activated. So anything can be spontaneous, and this can end up as a bit of a lifesaver, as in you've got yourself into trouble and you hope that the troops see the danger they're in and react accordingly to get themselves out of harm's way, because you've run out of the activation orders that you can send. Looking at just diverging off the sequence of play, if we go over here to the command display, what we have here is 2 sections. One is a track at the top, 1 to 9, and then an asset grid. So the asset grid is very simple. Is each of the HQs which are available to the company, so the CO, the XO, the first sergeant, the platoon HQs, MG platoon, mortar section, and then the gunnery sergeant section. These are the components that are owned by those HQs are present with the HQ counter. Otherwise, you'd have big stacks on the board. That's pretty much what all that's for, and that's it. Beyond that, you've got the track, which is actually quite important. Very similar in a way to the way Gallipoli played, in that that's where you put command tracks. So each of these commanders actually have a counter which can go on the track, where you actually, once you get the orders for your activation or your initiative, you put them onto the track, and then you move them down as you spend, and you also get to save them as well. And you flip the counter over when you've used what you wanted to use, or you've got down to 0. There are restrictions on how many you can actually spend in a turn, and also how many you can save. And again, it's dependent on the quality of the HQ that is there. You've got 3 qualities available: green, line, and veteran. And that's it. You don't get anything beyond that. Usually the line means there's no modifiers to anything. Green is 1 worse, veteran is 1 better. It does make quite a lot of difference, actually, green troops versus the veteran. Usually in actual activity during the game, it represents a number of card draws. So typically, if you want to do an activity, you usually draw 2 cards to find that activity symbol on the action cards. It's normally 2 for line, 3 for veteran, 1 for green. So you can see a veteran is 3 times as likely to do something as a green unit, but it's always quite exhilarating when a green unit actually does something great for you. There is a promotion system. There is an experience system. So between missions, you can actually get better troops. Although if you get casualties, you then replace them with new troops, which are of course usually green, unless there's something else is said. But that's the command display, and essentially the game is you manipulating the terrain grid and that display. That's where everything happens. There isn't really anything else to the board. So after we get the activity, the friendly command phase, and all the activities are done, usually it's over to the enemy. So the enemy gets their higher HQ, their battalion HQ pool, looking for an HQ symbol on a card. And if you do, again, you look up and randomize for 10 possibilities on what they're doing. Generally find that mostly they're useless, both on the positive and the negative side. Sometimes, very, very, very rarely, they're brilliant, just what you needed. And not quite so rarely, it's something that just really gets in the way, and you think, oh, what? And on the enemy side, something that you've just been planning to do something, and suddenly the battalion HQ on the opposition has woken up and just changed the whole way that's happening. And that's quite a surprise, and that's a hell of a randomizer, even though it's very simple. It's just one pull of a card followed by another one if you get the HQ symbol. That does create a huge variability in the scenarios. So beyond all the other that's kind of a strategic variation that will appear just when you least expect it. Sometimes positive, quite often quite negative. So that's what you have here. Then you also have the enemy activity check segment. So this is a lot of looking up. So you actually check to whatever enemy is on the board, what circumstances they are, and then you get a randomizer little table that says if it's in this condition, if it's under fire, if it's on the same card as a US unit, if it's hidden, or a combination. You have a little table that you run through. I'll just show you it here. This is the activity chart here, and you run down the chart, and whichever is the first applicable situation for the unit, you then use the little randomizer charts here to find out exactly what they've done. And you just run through the enemy and find out what they've done. Again, can be incredibly frustrating. Very, very occasionally you think, oh, thank God they did that. Fine, so that's the enemy part of the turn. Then we have the mutual capture and retreat phase. So this is the capability of getting the hell out of there. Now, sometimes that's pretty involuntary. So the state of your troops can disintegrate quite alarmingly and into very different states. You have your normal troops, usually in their formations. Now, that can be broken up into teams, and then from there, those teams can be of reduced usefulness, finally ending up into casualties, in which effectively they're out of the combat. Although casualties are useful in themselves, not trying to, in game terms, they still have a use, which is quite interesting as well. There are housekeeping that you do in this game, which is very, very relevant to real combat, but normally you wouldn't bother with in a war game. So that's quite interesting. I'll go into that later. So then you have the mutual vehicle aircraft phase. So it's the way when vehicles happen. So as I said, vehicles are taken out of the normal run of things, even though they do have their own command, and they do have a relationship usually with HQs on your side. They activate and move here rather than during the command phase, and also fire as well, and also be fired on. Very relevant in the Peleliu mission, in which actually you get brought on board by the tracked amphibious vehicles and dumped on the beach, and they come under fire themselves. So there's a lot of advice has been online about Fields of Fire 2, that if you're going to do the Peleliu, do it from mission 2, because you don't have to involve the vehicles so much. Or mission 3, I think, is the one without vehicles. So you can actually ignore that part of the rules. And there is something to do that, but you know what I'm like. I just jump in. And as I say, I am fairly familiar with the game system. So after the vehicle move and fire phase, then you have the combat phase. And the combat phase is a little odd, because the first thing you do is you just remove the previous fire missions that happened last turn. Then you evaluate what's known as potential contacts, so bringing new enemies on the board or new enemy effects onto the board. We'll go through that again a little later. And then finally you have the combat effects. Now here the combat effects are just a resolution. The combat is, shall I say, almost automatic in this game, as in troops will fire on troops. The enemy activity check will define what they do as far as firing goes. So all the firing decisions have been made already in the turn during the command phase and the enemy activity check, or even the potential contact resolution. So all that decisions have already been done. This is just the resolution of what is actually happening as far as firing goes. So the firing is very odd here, because there isn't very much of you sitting there and going, I'm going to fire on that. Your troops will fire on that if it's in their interest to fire, unless you've given a direct order to fire on that. Also, there's the concept of not firing. Again, your troops will open fire at anything that moves or anything they spot, and they won't stop even when that thing is not on the board anymore. It's you've turned them into casualties, or they've run away or something like that. They'll keep going until you tell them to stop. So as I say, the combat decision is earlier in the turn, and it's only now that there's the resolution. And you just go through each individual situation where there is a terrain card with units on, with what's known as volume of fire markers. These are red markers, which have various modifiers on them depending on what type of fire is actually coming in. and there may be different ones for the different combatants on the same card. If the US and the Japanese, in this case the Japanese, are on the same card, they may suffer different volume of fire markers. So that's that part, and then you're kind of on the end of the turn, and finally there is a cleanup phase. And the cleanup phase, sorry, I moved the combat effect segment is here. It was slightly off there, but here you are. I don't want to go through each individual little step, but that's where the resolution happens. Finally, you have a cleanup phase where you move markers which are become obsolete due to it being the end of the turn. Particularly one that's really nice is you remove exposed markers, which is when you move your troops around. They have a negative modifier that attaches to them for the rest of the turn and makes them much more vulnerable, and it's quite a relief to remove these exposed markers. Your troops settle down into normal cover. So that's the sequence of play there. And so there's a number of turn-on scenarios. The Peleliu landings, mission 1, is actually 10 turns long, so it's quite a long one. For example, the second mission is actually only 4 turns long, so they can vary quite a bit. I haven't seen a scenario go beyond 10 though, so that's about as long as it gets. I could be wrong there, others, but for memory and Fields of Fire, when I've played, 10 has been the usual number, and it usually hasn't gone beyond that, but sometimes 6 or 4 or something like that. But that's in each of the scenario setup information. Continuing on, we look at the counters now available in the game. There's quite a few here to go through, but we'll run through it quickly, and there's various groupings. We can look at them several at a time. Looking at the top here we have what are known as teams. So these are single step personnel units. The step is denoted by the single dot at the bottom there. There are command teams, which the company HQ, the CO HQ is one. You have forward observers, spotters, etc. Machine gun teams. This is a weapons team, a bazooka team here. That you'll see these in the scenario. That's a demolition squad team, not squad. Flamethrower team, and these are Japanese. So that's a leader, sort of equivalent to a command team, although they work in a different way for the enemy. And that's a 20mm gun team there as well. So these are all one step. And those are the normal teams you'll find in the game in good order. Now, when these can be reduced in their effectiveness, and also you can produce teams from squads. The squads are actually in the third row. Should have really reordered this, but these are examples of squads. These are the 2 Marine squads here. There's a Japanese squad. Again, the dots denote the steps, and the Marines have 4 steps, whereas the Japanese only have 3. In Field of Fire 1, the American Army squads actually had 3 as well, and it says in the rules that it gives the Marines 4 steps because they had extra firepower, because they were issued with extra Browning automatic rifles within the squad. So that's the rationale behind it, though it's the same number of men. When there's a casualty on a team, the team will be taken off. With a squad, it will be reduced. So if you over here, we've got a reduced squad here, down to 3. Now, when that's another loss, you'll get down to 2. So you'll swap it with another counter, and beyond that, you will get a fire team. Now, that's part of the, if you like, lower quality teams that are available once losses are taken, or essentially morale problems appear. So looking back up onto this line, these are the teams available. So an assault team is actually a good thing. Actually, it's usually you produce those to scout ahead. And produce those out of squads. To do that, they can actually appear as a result of a hit effect. It seems a sort of command separation and sort of individual initiative may result of that. You have fire teams, which are essentially the neutral single team, which has lost its primary purpose. So it's detached from a squad, or it is one of the other teams, say a weapons team, which has lost its ability to effectively do its job, and it turns into just a bunch of soldiers. Then below that you have the litter team. So this is an even less effective formation. That formation, effectively what they're trying to do is remove casualties from under fire. And that's really their job. You have a paralysed team, which is here, which is effectively they're cowering. They will try and run away, or will stick in cover when there's no fire around, but won't actually be particularly useful. And finally, there's casualties. Then it's not necessarily death, but wounded, etc. But I think what they call it, hors de combat. So unavailable to be used further in the mission. You can improve the morale state of these teams back up to, say, a fire team, and fire teams can be reintegrated into squads. Although if it's a weapons team or something like that, or a command team, you have to treat them differently. Usually you can't reconstitute them, they'll just stay a fire team, but you can use higher command teams to rebuild HQs during the mission. Okay, so that's squads and teams here. The idea of having a casualty counter is relevant. In the game, you actually gain experience points for actually collecting your casualties. Also, you will get it for capturing the enemy casualties. Also, you can capture, and we saw it briefly. There was a retreat and capture phase. You can capture enemy paralysed and litter teams, I believe. They will just give up and surrender as well, and you can get points for that. So looking beyond the normal infantry here, we get onto vehicles. This is an example of vehicle. This is an LVT, which will be in the mission. So this is a transporter, really. And that can disembark units from it and move as a vehicle. And they move and fire in the vehicle and aircraft segment. There are tanks in the game as well, a few other vehicles as well. There are jeeps in the field of fire one. I haven't really seen them in this one as well. Just to have a look at what else is on the counter. So I talked about the different types, and actually the picture in them tells you what kind of unit they really are. So the helmet will be an HQ of some kind, and these symbols. There are some changes of symbols you can find with the assault teams and fire teams, etc. That's usually because of the different eras, because they had different weapons. So you have to be a little careful in the game to pick exactly the right teams and squads that are relevant for the era. There are some duplications which aren't really duplications, and I mean, you can get away with if it's just silhouettes, but usually, aesthetically, you'd like to stick with what you have. So here with an assault team, we have a Thompson, and this is a Garand rifle. So what you don't want to see an M16 or something like that, which those counters do exist. Looking what else is on there, there's two relevant usually letters in the bottom left and bottom right. The bottom left is the type of fire that unit dishes out. So we have things like an S and an A, that's automatic fire. This is small arms fire. You can see, for example, here we have an H, which is heavy weapons fire. What you can also have is you have a superscript, which is usually a grenade attack, or which is a G with a exclamation mark. That means that you have to roll to see if the attack actually happens correctly. Here's a D for demo and F for flame attack, which again, these tend to be for the same hex. So you have to, they have a point blank range. The second letter is actually the range of the primary type of fire. So if we look at this assault team, they have small arms fire normally, which works at close range, but they also have the ability to fire a grenade attack, which is actually the bazooka rocket. Here there's automatic weapons fire at long range. Remember, it's point blank is same card, close is adjacent card, long range is 2 cards away, and very long range, which is a V, is 3 cards away. Here's an example of a V here for this 20mm gun. And as you can see, vehicles are no different. They have the same kind of setting. So that's the personnel units in the game, pretty much. Now we have information markers, and some of these are just things like ammunition and fire types. But there's also terrain here, and radios and pyrotechnics. So looking at these red markers here, these are the fire indication markers, VOF, or volume of fire markers generally. As you can see, these have VOF. These are actually the volume of fire markers. You place these on the card where fire is coming into that card of that type. Normally, etiquette says that you always pick the best fire, as in the most damaging fire. And as you can see, you've got numbers here, which is a modifier when you look up on the to hit. So as you can see, small arms is a 0, whereas heavy weapons is a -3. So that's a much more lethal fire. You have the ability to apply a crossfire as well if you get fire coming in from more than one card. You have a grenade attack here as well, so that is -4 for the US, -3 for everybody else. They have better grenades, it seems, or more of them. And you have incoming. This is a fire mission, so generally when the opposition fires, it just lands, whereas if you want to place it with yourself, so on your side, for example, with the artillery, is that an artillery? Yeah, forward observer there, then you'd actually have to go through a fire mission procedure to actually see where it places and what happens. And depending on what fire it is, what you're firing, it will have a variable damage marker as well. Finally, is a PDF, which is nothing to do with Davy. It's actually primary direction of fire. So these are arrows which you put between cards to denote where the fire is coming from and where it is going to. Of course, if both sides can see each other, you'd actually have a double-headed arrow like this to show that fire's going either way. So the how you'd show it normally is you'd have a PDF running between 2 cards, and then on each card you would have the volume of fire marker that's been dished out from the other side. There is another one known as concentrate fire, which gives you another -1. So normally you pick the best VOF. You would add crossfire. Grenades tend to sort of take over because they're much more lethal, as does the artillery. So next here we've got ammunition markers. So weapons teams, you can put on ammunition. You can either mark it down off the game, or you can use these markers, and they just you move them about to see how much ammunition you have left. As you fire, you will use one of these markers. Machine guns have it as well. Not just this is rocket artillery here. Bazooka rockets here as well. Pyrotechnics. So usually it's only on the American side that you'll see this. You have smoke here. You've got white phosphorus smoke and normal smoke. Then what you have is you have coloured smoke or coloured pyrotechnics. So this is a flare. It says a red star cluster flare. So what you do is you mark down before you do the mission what the different coloured smoke and clusters and parachute flares that you have in your inventory, what they mean. And those can be used as an order in its own right. And you can then you can fire that off. An HQ can fire it off to actually pass on an order to the units that can see it. So there's an LOS element to them. Because they're up in the air, it's much easier to see. And finally, you have radios. So again, the command teams, so company, platoon, the first sergeant, sections, etc., any of these HQs will have a radio, or they could have a phone set, a field phone set. I haven't shown you those. We'll be using radios at the start. And they have, depending on the era, they have a range themselves. So, for example, this is your standard radio here, World War II one, and that has a range of 1 card. So you can talk adjacent cards. But beyond that, you can't. It's a kind of you can go beyond, I think, because of line of sight. If it's something isn't a line of sight, then the radio will work and go beyond the card. But generally, it's just the card. There are also battalion radios, and this is generally the radio that the CO has to talk back to battalion HQ. So you'll see those as well. Radios can be given to forward observers as well, so that they can be in communication. Mortar forward observers. There are several types of forward observer you could have, and they generally have these radios as well to communicate. So finally, we look at the potential contact markers. So there are 3 types: A, B, and C. Generally, A is more lethal than B, which is more lethal than C. In the mission we have, it's slightly been changed for this mission, and the lethality also affects the likelihood of something actually turning up when you encounter one of these counters. So normally you'd have one of these counters on a card. When you move on to that card, you will resolve that potential contact, and depending on whether it's an A, B, or C, you would pull a number of cards and look for the word contact in the general icons area of the action cards. Any of the cards that you pull, if that contact text comes up, then there is a contact, and you will pick more cards for an A than you would for a C, and also it depends on the current situation in the game. So there are what known as enemy activity statuses. So there's these markers here which you keep handy somewhere. Now normally you'll start with no contact. That means it's more likely that something will turn up. In fact, it's automatic for, say, A's and B's. If you have a volume of fire marker from an enemy somewhere, then you are engaged. No, you have contact. That's this one, which is a less likely for something to turn up. If you have 2, then you are engaged, which is this one. No, sorry, can't read what I'm doing. Engaged is there. And then finally, the last one is heavily engaged, and that's when you are engaged plus you have units on the same card as well. And each of these states married with the A, B, or C gives you the number of cards you pull. And more heavily engaged, the less cards you pull. The C's and B's and A's. So A's you pull more than B's and C's. And there's a matrix to look at to see how many cards you pull to see if you get a contact. If you get that contact, you'll then go through a series of tables to find out what's turned up, where it is, and what is it doing, and then you place that on the board. So that's the potential contact markers. There's a special use for them in the first scenario, which I will go through during the scenario. After that, we have cover markers. So as I said, on the cards, it has a cover value and then has cover markers which you can find
using a seek cover order, seeking cover order, and generally there'll be this cover +1. Though there are field fortifications that can be added by the game. It's usually the opposition that have got this, or sometimes you can have these. There are trenches, foxholes, and this one, it happens to be a bunker. And a bunker's a bit special in that it has a direction of fire, and that's the only direction of fire it can fire in. And so it doesn't have a field of fire like all the others. Units, etc., can fire in any direction. Bunkers are one direction only. Finally, there are skill counters. So you will earn these. Also, you may start a campaign with them as well. These are one-use, extra little choice things you can do, use them or lose them kind of thing, where it'll give you an ability to do something or some small bonus, and those will be assigned to platoon HQs and or HQs inside your company, and they have that special ability. And once it's used, it's gone, or if you don't use it, it goes at the end of the mission. That's pretty much all the counters I wanted to show. There are quite a few others, but it kind of gives an idea of what we have here. One I haven't showed you, which I will show you now, is this chap here, is the exposed counter. So when you move, even on the same card with your troops, or the enemy moves as well, you place this counter on with a -2. It's red, so it affects volume of fire. So this is a modifier, a bit like crossfire is, and -2, of course, is really not very good for you. What also happened is when you're checking if somebody's been hit, you could be missed, or you could be hit, in which case you look at the hit's effect, or you could be pinned, and you put this counter on. This makes it slightly tougher, because you get a +1 at defense as if you were in cover effectively. But pinned is a little bit like these teams here, where you, and actually they call it in the game LATs, or limited action teams, and pinned is one of those, but it's a state of a unit. The unit doesn't change, it just have pinned placed upon it. And each of these are restricted on what you can order them to do. Usually you want to get them out of the state they're actually in, is usually what you do. Although I will go through orders just as the final part of this intro, because it is quite important. Also, I'll just do last few bits and pieces. But that's the counters for you. You'll see a lot of pins and exposeds, volume of fire markers as well. But the units tend to, be at the start, and they'll hopefully stay there. And potential contact markers will be around at the start scenario, and slowly you'll be taking them off as you resolve them, whether something appears or not. Okay, that's the counters. Right, so finally, I just want to go through the commands, or actually, in the game they're called actions. So this is effectively the orders that you give out or to do something, an activity. So there are 4 sections: command and control, movement, rally, and combat. They're grouped. It's just for convenience, really. It doesn't really matter too much about what types of actions they are. Again, as I said, with the limited action teams, like the litter teams and the paralysed, etc., you have a restricted version of these. But this is available for, not standard units. These are relevant to to your units. As I say, the enemy activity is done on a lookup chart and with a randomizer to see what they do. So this is only really relevant to the American side. So just looking at them, so if we have the command and control ones here, I know it's pretty little writing, but I'll just sort of rattle them off. So you can activate. So this is an HQ can activate something, even another HQ, if it's of a lower hierarchy. So CO can activate a platoon HQ, and that means that it can draw a card for its command points. You can exhort. So if you're ordering an action from a unit and you do your action pulls of your deck, the number of cards you need to take, if you fail, you can exhort, you can spend an extra command point, and you get an extra card to try, just the one. So that's just sometimes it's very, very useful to do that when you're really upset you haven't been able to do something you really needed to do. You can reconstitute commands. I talked about this here, where if you lose your particular HQ, or it gets turned into a fire team, this is the ability to reconstitute and bring back, either by promoting people or rallying the people who are in the original team. You can produce runners as well. We talked about radios. We talked about the communication with pyrotechnics. What you can also do is a higher HQ can produce a runner and send it to another HQ, as in it walks across the board or runs, and you can then supply an order to that other unit or HQ. Those are the main ones really that we need to deal with. Then we have movement actions. So of course there's move, but you can move a squad or a team, or you can actually move a whole platoon. There's usually a platoon HQ can do that. The issue is when you move, you get an exposed marker at -2. So if there's things firing at you, or there's a potential contact marker, it's quite risky. But that's the move. Usually it costs a command point to move a team or a squad, 2 points to move an entire platoon, and they all have to be stacked together on the same card. You can infiltrate. So rather than move onto a card, if that card has a volume of fire marker, I think something's firing at it, you can attempt to infiltrate instead. So it's on card pools, and you're looking for effectively a symbol which looks like three crouching soldiers in black. If we come across it during the game, I've pointed out, but that's what. And what that means is you can get onto the card without the exposed marker. Very, very useful sometimes for reinforcement. But there's a risk. If you fail, you move with the exposed marker. So you need to be prepared to fail here on that. You can find cover, so an order to find cover is a movement. So you do that terrain check, the pulling of the cards, depending on what the terrain is and what's available, and then you can move into that cover if you find it. Of course, if you don't, you're exposed again. You can load or unload or embark or disembark from vehicles, or load and unload ammunition from as well. Pick stuff up if you want to. That's another movement action. Looking at rally actions, you can order an action for a remove of pin. So it's kind of a rally. You can detach teams from squads. You can supplement squads by putting teams back into, if they're in the same card, and beefing up the squad. You can reconstitute squads if you have available fire teams where that squad has been removed. So that's the rally stuff you can do. Finally, what you can also do is improve the state of limited action teams. So if you're paralysed, you can upgrade it to a list team, and a list team can be upgraded to a fire team. And you can also create assault teams as well as part of that order. And indeed, you can detach them out of squad. So that's rallying. And finally, in combat. One thing you'll find is when you get a potential contact which is an enemy, they will usually be hidden, in which case you can't fire at them because you don't know. They'll fire at you, but you can't fire at them. Nobody can, because nobody knows what's to shoot at. They're just getting the bullets coming at them. So one's very important is a command to an action to spot. And again, on card draws, what you're looking for is crosshairs as a symbol, and then you can reveal that unit and you can start firing at it. So that's quite critical during the game. You can concentrate fire. That is get an extra -1 by pretty much the commanders, directing the fire. Said no, don't fire at all those bushes. Fire at that particular bush. So that gets you a little bit of a bonus. Pretty much for a turn. You can order for grenade or demo or flamethrower attacks to happen. You can call for fire. Now there are artillery forward observers. However, the platoons, platoon HQs and the CO HQ, etc., anything with a radio, which is a command, has a chance of calling in artillery fire or any other particular fire. For the first scenario, you actually have naval gunfire, which pretty much any of the forward observers or the HQs could call in if you want to, and that's a combat action there. A ceasefire, very important when you've got limited ammo and things like machine guns, so that you don't use it all up. You can order a ceasefire. Switch fire, which is stop firing at that card, fire at this card. Again, that's another one that can be and usually this is to individual units or to other HQs. We have a thing called final protective fire. You only usually see this in defensive missions where there's a set, usually used by machine guns, where you have a set direction of fire which you lay down, and this is the order that kicks that off as well. That's pretty much all I want to do on the actions. There's lots available there. Most of them you have to pull action cards and find a particular icon to do. Finally, what else do we want to go through? That's pretty much it. The last one thing I want to show you is what's called the mission log. So this is not absolutely needed, but I think it's very, very useful. These come with the game in that you can organise your company. And so you have all the HQs and the subordinate units laid out in front of you. You use the V, L, and G to denote the quality of the unit. So L is line, V is veteran, G is green. You can also mark the ammunition. You can put in your fire support. So this is the naval fire, and the capability of each of the different types of HQs and forward observers have. That's the number of cards you draw to find the icon you need, which is a sort of explosion. And then the number of fire missions is how many available. So there's only one in this game, and if you use it, you'll mark it as used. You can also list the attachments. So you can the non-company assets you have, forward observers, assault teams, etc., like the bazooka teams or the demo teams, etc. You can assign those to a platoon, or particularly any of the HQs, so that it's actually attached to that and will receive orders from that as if it was a native unit. And here you list them and their experience and then what they're attached to. Down here you have the pyrotechnics, which you can essentially assign meaning to each of the different types of pyrotechnics you have. And finally up here you decide whether you're using field phones or radios as well. On the back, this is an old sheet where you can list further stuff about the attachments you have, their experience. You can assign, if they have casualties, you can write those down here, and any ammunition they've used. As I said, you could use the counters or you could use this sheet. And then also the enemy info. So when you encounter something, you list it here so you can keep track of those units on the log. Again, not absolutely necessary to use this, but I do find it very useful, and I'll be using it as part of the replay of mission 1. Just reevaluating what I've told you. I think that's pretty much it that I want to cover. We'll go through the mission, and we'll encounter some more rules, and I'll explain to you at the time what they are and what they mean. A few other counters as well. This is a very stylized mission 1 in Peleliu, because of course it's an amphibious assault. So initially it'll be all about landing LVT vehicles, landing on beaches, etc., and receiving fire. And then it'll it'll then move on to a more traditional activity that Fields of Fire 2 and Fields of Fire 1 would normally have. That's about it for the moment. I don't want to make this too long. I know I've made it really long, and I do that in the intros because I like to cover a decent amount of ground, give you a good introduction as well. Hopefully, sometimes you can refer back to it. But then the next video will be the start of the mission, and hopefully you'll join me for that. So thanks for watching this far. As always, these are all long videos, and I tend to chatter quite a lot, but hopefully this has been useful information, and if nothing else, gives you an idea of what the game is like, and what it's about and what the components are. I haven't gone through all the sheets and tables here yet because we'll use those during the mission. Just the action menus I just went through for you there. So I'll see you next time, hopefully, for the begin of Mission 1, which is the initial assault on the island of Peleliu by the 5th Marines and our particular company that's doing that. So hopefully I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.